Ma'am, you are able to hear?
Audio. Okay. So now how do I go back to presentation? Now you see my presentation? Okay. Okay, good. Thanks. Am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am, you are audible.
Okay. Yeah. Can I start?
Yeah, ma'am, I will give introduction to you, then you can start.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, very good afternoon to everyone. And we are very sorry, we faced some technical issue. That's why we could not start on time. So on behalf of DDH training team and our director, Dr. GN Sastry, I welcome you all for the first vertical session. And today the first vertical one lecture will be delivered by Professor Lalita Guru Prasad, who is professor in University of Hyderabad. Dr. Lalita Guru Prasad has obtained her MSc as well as PhD in chemistry from Usmania University, Hyderabad. After a couple of postdoc, she has joined as a faculty in School of Chemistry in University of Hyderabad, and her group activities is mainly to understand protein sequence to structure and function correlation using state-of-the-art molecular modeling techniques. With this small introduction, I request Professor Lalita Guru Prasad to deliver the talk on protein 3D structure, modeling and applications. Ma'am, please.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Nagamani, for the kind introduction. And I also thank Dr. Shastri for the kind invitation asking me to speak in DDH 2020. It's in fact an honor to be able to, participate in this very important activity of CSIR. Without much delay, because we have already lost some time, I'm sorry about that. I'll come to the main topic. I'll try to tell you what is the use of protein structures and how to make best use of them. And the whole purpose of this is to be able to model the structures of proteins, to be able to model the 3D structures of proteins, and then be able to make good use of them in terms of, trying to tell where the mutations are, how a small molecule could bind to it, is it possible to predict the function of a protein based upon its structure, so on and so forth are the examples that I would like to give you. I just kept the introduction very broad because I was not sure what kind of audience I'm speaking to, or rather what your background is. So the first few slides are very basic introductory slides. What are proteins? Proteins are biological macromolecules. These are polymers. These are unbranched polymers, and their sequence goes from N-terminal end towards the C-terminal end. That is a free amine group towards a free carboxylic acid group. And the information for the proteins is coming basically from the hereditary information, which is DNA. So DNA to RNA to protein is the direction in which normally the genetic information will flow. This is called as a central dogma of molecular biology. And proteins are made up of 20 standard amino acids. There are some non-standard amino acids, never mind. These are alpha amino acids because to the same central carbon, you have a COOH group as well as a primary amine bound linked. And most of the proteins function as enzymes. And there are some proteins which actually act as connectors. That is, they're able to bind to either a carbohydrate or a lipid, or these are accessory domains involved in protein-protein interactions. And some of the proteins are also involved in coating of certain, say, bacteria and so on. So I'll just show you one slide to tell you what is this. This is actually a part of the biological chemistry where we are talking about the chemistry of the living systems. And this is the 20 structures of 20 different amino acids. And the smallest amino acid will have a side chain, which is a hydrogen. And the largest amino acid could be either a arginine or a tryptophan, depending upon what you are looking at, either in terms of the bulk or the chain length. But all the amino acids will have a C alpha carbon here, and a carboxylic acid group and a primary amine, and there's an invariant hydrogen and a variable side chain. So two amino acids come together, they fuse together to form something called as a peptide bond with the release of a water molecule. And this newly formed peptide bond will have a C double bond O NH. This is the newly formed bond. And this C double bond O NH is called as a peptide bond or amide bond. The basic nature of the electronegativity of the carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen will make this bond not any more planar as indicated here, but then this will have a partial double bond character. And the partial double bond character of this particular bond is responsible for the planarity of the peptide bond. So, so one can think of a cis-trans configuration about this peptide bond because of the partial double bond character. But often a trans configuration is most stable, as we all have learned in basic chemistry. Sometimes cis is also possible more in terms of the amino acid proline. As indicated here, proline is a cyclic amino acid. It has a secondary amine group. Only in the case of proline, you can have a cis group, a cis configuration, otherwise it's often a trans configuration. And also, the nature has come up with a very nice chirality where we say that only L amino acids are responsible for making up the proteins. D amino acids are present only when it is a part of a peptidoglycan layer on certain bacterial cell wall. So L amino acid basically indicates, adheres to something called as a Kohn rule. That is, you look through the hydrogen and then you have you look through the hydrogen at the central carbon and then you have a COR, that is a variable R group, and NH in the clockwise direction. And right, so we have just seen that proteins are made up of amino acids, and amino acids are now linked by peptide bonds. So the hierarchy of protein structure can be classified into 4 different stages. One is the primary structure, where you have a sequence of amino acids strung together like beads in a, say, a pearl necklace. And then you have a secondary structure, which can be either an alpha helix or a beta strand. And many beta strands come together to form something called as a sheet in a protein. And yeah, so you have several such secondary structural elements that are arranged in space in such a manner that they are connected by certain random regions, either the loops or the turn regions in proteins. And that is called as the tertiary structure of the protein. And tertiary structure of the protein, or a properly folded structure of the protein, is the one that is actually functional. If the protein does not fold to its right three-dimensional structure, then believe me that the protein will not have any function, or it will have lower activity compared to the correctly folded one. Some of the proteins cannot function as a monomeric unit, but then they will require aggregates of it, aggregates in the sense ordered, coming together in an ordered manner. So this is the example of the structure of a hemoglobin. So you have a primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures of proteins, right? So now what we have seen is that you have a okay, so this is a very simple molecule, butane, and if you take the butane molecule and if one does a rotation about C2 to C3 carbon, and so when you do a rotation, what we can do is something called as a calculate the torsion angle or the dihedral angle. And if you plot the dihedral angle or the torsion angle versus the energy, you get a plot that looks like this. Basically, what it means is that you have an eclipsed structure where both the CH3s are coming on the same direction about the butane, and then this particular molecule is having very high energy, and then you have a certain intermediate stage which is either a Gauss structure, but basically you have the most stable structure, which is the anti-structure or the staggered structure. And the difference in energy between the most stable structure, that is least energy to the highest energy, is about 5 kcal per mole. So if a C4 system, that is a system with 4 carbons, is having so many different conformations, and if it has one unique conformation that is most stable, a protein which has many amino acids will have very many conformations. Theoretically, the number of conformations for a protein structure are very many. Let us say a smallest protein has about 100 amino acids, and each protein along the main chain there are about 3 amino acids N, C, alpha, C, and there are about 1 to 6 atoms depending upon which side chain we are talking about. Therefore, given that there are so many atoms and these atoms are connected by single bonds, the conformations that are possible for a protein are very many. They go into several, you just can't calculate those numbers. So the conformational flexibility of the protein is high. But despite the number of conformations of proteins that are theoretically possible are very many, the proteins always fold into one unique structure, which is the thermodynamically most stable structure. And this structure is responsible for the function of it. So theoretically, many conformations are possible, but experimentally or practically, what we see is that there is only one unique structure. So how does one arrive at how does one solve the structure of a protein is the question. So what is a protein structure? The protein structure gives you the detailed arrangement, knowledge about the spatial arrangement of all atoms within the protein sequence, and this defines the overall 3D structure of the protein. And the experiment, there are many ways by which one can solve the structures of proteins. X-ray crystallography is the best method, and recently the cryo-electron microscopy also has picked up, and there are many structures of proteins that are being solved. In fact, if you see I think all of you will also be interested in doing the modeling of the this SARS coronavirus, the new SARS coronavirus proteins. In that, the spike protein structure is solved. The entire protein structure has been solved using the cryo-electron microscopy only. NMR is again a very useful method to solve the structures of proteins, especially those which will not crystallize. It's very hard to crystallize proteins. So then NMR is a useful method. And there are computational methods that can be used at arriving at the structures of the proteins. As you can see here, from 1962, like in the last 6 decades, there are Nobel Prizes have been given for methods to solve the structures of proteins. And when the structures of and all of these have gone to these are all chemistry Nobel Prizes. And once a structure of a protein is solved, it is stored in or deposited in a database at rcsb.org. And so why is it that one is interested in understanding the structures of proteins? Because a protein structure is able to give us insights into the molecular basis of their function. That is the important reason why one would want to solve the structure of a protein or understand the structure of a protein. And once you understand this protein structure, it is possible that you can find out which residues are important for a particular disease, which residues are important for binding to another protein, which residues are important for catalytic activity. So therefore, one can design experiments to mutate these residues and prove whether the hypothesis is right or wrong. And based upon the structure of a protein or based upon the active site of a protein, one can actually design a mimic of a substrate that binds to the active site of the enzyme. Therefore, you now have a substrate-based inhibitor, and then one can actually refine it further. Therefore, one can also design specific inhibitors based on the structure. And most importantly, when you do not know anything about the structure of if you only know the structure, then depending upon the active site and comparing it with the structures that have been solved earlier, it is possible to propose the structure, function of a protein. So there are many reasons why one should solve the structures of proteins. I'll quickly show you two examples. One is the a protein BCR-ABL kinase that is important in blood cancer. This is what the structure of the protein looks like. It has many strands in the N-terminus and it has many helices in the C-terminus. While you have a very large protein, it is only this small molecule called as a Gleevec, which is based upon pyrimidines, pyridines, and a certain amide bond comprising groups, and importantly, a piperazine ring. This is an inhibitor that binds to the active site of the enzyme at the hinge region between the N-terminus and the C-terminus. And the binding of this molecule to the hinge region of the protein or to the ATP band of this protein will be able to inhibit the active site of, will be able to inhibit the activity of the enzyme. Therefore, this is a very good drug for BCR-ABL kinase. This is another example of I'm not showing the entire protein here, I'm just showing you the active site here, the functional site of a protein. This particular drug molecule shown in line representation is called as darunavir. This is a drug molecule that binds to the dimeric protein or a homodimeric protein, which is basically HIV protease. Here you see that you have a chain on this side, and then you have primed amino acids on the right side. This is the second dimeric protein. This is the second dimer of the, this is the second homomer of the protein. And together in the dimeric form, this protein, this molecule is able to inhibit the activity of HIV protease. Therefore, darunavir is a very good HIV protease. So I have just shown you two examples of how inhibitors can bind to the enzyme active site and therefore inhibit the enzyme activity, and therefore these make very good drug molecules. Right. So I'm now trying to introduce you to the concept of protein structure modeling. I've shown you examples, or I've given you reasons why the protein structure is important. I've given you the methods by which the protein structure can be solved, and then I've also shown you the applications of protein structure. So the very early work of Christian Anephensen, in fact, this work once again led to a Nobel Prize in the year 1972. He has taken this protein called as ribonuclease A. Ribonuclease A has 4 disulfide bonds, and this is a small protein, compactly folded protein stabilized by disulfide bonds. So what he has done is he has taken the native protein and then he has unfolded the protein, opened up the protein by adding urea, which will remove the disulfide bonds, and the beta-mercaptoethanol has been added to reduce the disulfide bond such that there are free SH groups that are actually present. So once you take a native protein, a correctly folded protein, reduce it in the presence of urea and beta-mercaptoethanol, that is, you take the protein from a native state to a denatured state. And then the protein, the urea has been removed, and then the protein has been oxidized, and then it has been shown that the protein has gained its entire activity. But then if only the urea is, but then if you randomly allow the disulfide bonds to be formed by removal of, the removal of the beta-mercaptoethanol, then it so happens that only 1% of the protein is in fact active, which basically means that 4 cysteines can randomly form 105 different possibilities of disulfide bonds. Therefore, 105 is close to 1. Therefore, it says that out of all the folded forms, there is only one form which is actually having the correct disulfide connectivity. Therefore, only 1% of the protein is active. So, based on his experiment, what he has shown is that a correctly folded protein is the functional protein, but more importantly, what his experiments have shown is that the information for a protein to fold lies in its amino acid sequence. And right, so what it also basically means is that a thermodynamically folded protein, a low energy conformation of a protein, is the most stable and folded form. There are certain, there was another paradox proposed again in 1960s by Cyrus Leventhal. What he had said is that if you have a 100 amino acid protein, and if this 100 amino acid protein will basically have 99 peptide bonds, and 99 peptide bonds can have 2 rotatable bonds which are phi and psi. I'll tell you what are phi and psi when I come to the Ramachandran plot. Basically, I said that in a given protein, in an opened up structure of a protein or any structure of a protein, you basically have two different rotatable bonds, N-C alpha, between N-C alpha C, you have N-C alpha a phi rotation, C alpha C a psi rotation, phi psi, N-C alpha phi, and the other one is phi. So given the possibility of phi and psi rotations in a given protein, even if there are three different possibilities for a phi and three different possibilities for a psi, then the number of possible conformations for a protein are 3 raised to the power of 198. And given that 10 to the power of 13 rotations can be made about a bond in per second, these many calculations for a 100 amino acid protein should take about 10 to the power of 27 years. That is, for a protein to find its unique structure, it should take astronomical figure 10 to the power of 27 years. But then he already knew that protein folding takes place at the order of milliseconds or microseconds. Therefore, what Cyrus Leventhal had proposed is that the protein will not go through searching all the conformational states, but then it actually goes through only few intermediate stage, and these intermediate states and the contacts between them is responsible for a protein to fold into its correctly folded state. So for example, this is called as a free energy funnel of a protein. This is the first intermediate stage, folding intermediate, and then you have one more folding state, but then you also actually have a correctly folded state or a native state of a protein. But while a protein folds, if at all it gets into some random folding pattern, then it is possible that they actually go into such amorphous aggregates. These are low in energy, very low in energy, but then they are non-functional. And then there are many proteins like Alzheimer's proteins, which actually go into such into the formation of amyloid fibrils, low energies, but then these are irreversible foldings of proteins. So there are many experiments that were done early to show that proteins are indeed functional. The amino acid sequence for a protein lies in its, the structure of a protein lies in its amino acid sequence. So what is the need for modeling is what I will show you in the next couple of slides. In the last, I would say 2 decades, or I would say 17 to 18 years, the genomes of many different organisms are being sequenced, the complete nucleotide sequence. For example, you have so many eukaryotes, so many prokaryotes, viruses, so on and so forth. So the number of sequences that are coming from the genome sequencing projects run into several millions of sequences, but then the number of structures that are solved is hardly 167,000. So this is a much smaller number compared to the number of sequences that are actually available. So there's a huge gap between the number of sequences known and the number of structures available. Therefore, modeling the structure of a protein based upon its primary sequence becomes very meaningful. And also the number of sequences, the number of structures that are known and deposited in PDB, the number of unique structures for which the sequences are known are still lower. It is roughly half of this particular number here. Only 88,000 are the unique structures for which the sequences for which the structures are known. And then we have, and the structures of the proteins when they are dissected, we say that the protein structures can be categorized into number of folds, and the number of folds are actually only close to 1400. So we know very little about the protein sequence structures, but then we know a lot more about the number of protein sequences. And whenever a new genome is sequenced by the sequencers, by the genome people, it has been seen that only 40% of the proteins are known in terms of function annotation or structure annotation. There are about 60% of the proteins for which there is no information known. Therefore, these are the reasons therefore it becomes very important to be able to add value to the genomes by doing this kind of homology modeling of the proteins. And importantly, I said that there are only 88,000 proteins for which the sequences for which the structures are known, right? But then if you take the number of proteins for which the structures are known at say 30% sequence identity, the number actually is much lower. It is only 35,000, which basically means that even when one tries to add value to the genome by trying to model the protein, by trying to arrive at a function, it is not easy, because the number of proteins that we know are only about 35,000, which share about 30% sequence identity or lower. So what we actually face is a quite a tricky situation, and therefore one has to understand that the homology searches or the BLAST searches often may not give you the correct template to model the proteins, but one has to resort to something else called as a fault prediction methods, so on and so forth. So the job of a protein structure modeler is to be able to bridge the gap between the number of sequences known in the protein sequence data bank versus the number of structures that can be added by modeling the structures of the protein. Modeling the structure of a protein is not a big deal. There are many servers that actually do it. But then I would say that the greater beauty or challenge lies in adding to the functional value of the protein. Therefore, it is from sequence to structure and then the function. Here, the computational methods can be applied in a very elegant manner. And why are we trying to do this? Because as I said earlier, if you have to use either the cryo-electron microscopy or X-ray diffractometry or the NMR, then all these will require the purified protein from a laboratory using molecular biology techniques, followed by protein purification. And many a times, this is not a straightforward task because of various reasons. The protein may not be able to crystallize, or first of all, you may not be able to see, all these proteins are present at nanomolar concentration in a living cell. But then if you try to express the protein and if you keep it in higher concentration in a test tube or an Eppendorf tube in the laboratory, then the protein may not be stable. It might begin to aggregate. So the problems that a protein biochemist faces are many. And again, importantly, even if you're able to purify a protein and make it soluble, it might so happen that the protein may not crystallize. So there are many difficulties that one faces. Therefore, to be able to solve the structure of a protein, to be able to model the structure of a protein using the rational methods, which are the modeling methods, it's a good strategy. But I would always say that the experiment is the proof. Whenever possible, whenever the structure is solved for the protein 10 years from now, 20 years from now, or maybe the very next month, it is always good to compare the model with the experimental structure and see which regions have actually gone wrong. That way, one is able to tell whether the model has been built is correct or incorrect, and most importantly, whatever inferences you have made based on the model, we will know whether they are valid or not. And there is a competition called as a critical assessment of protein structures. Such competitions actually will allow somebody to model the structure of a protein and see whether the modeling methods fare well or not. Again, I'm just reiterating what I've just said. Why take a protein sequence? Because the genome sequences have maybe in a month's time one is able to do the genome sequencing, and the genome sequencer is able to deposit 4,000 sequences at the minimum into the sequence data bank. But then working with all the 4,000 sequences, doing experiments with them is not a easy task. Therefore, to be able to make most of the sequences that are coming from the genome sequences, one can use these computational methods. And more importantly, homology or similarity between two or more sequences mean that they have come from a common ancestor. That is, if we are able to align or write two amino acid, if we are able to, alignment basically is to write two sequences of protein, one below the other, such that we try to maximize the regions of similarity at the most, and wherever are the regions of dissimilarity can be either accommodated by insertions or deletions, right? And these insertions and deletions usually occur in the loop regions in the proteins. So if two sequences are similar, then it is also likely that these two sequences will fold into the similar structure. Very recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, there are certain converse to this particular statement, but still this is a very valid statement. And therefore, if two sequences look alike, then it is possible that they will have a similar structure, and proteins with similar structure can also have similar function. Also, there are many exceptions to this, so these things have to be taken very carefully. And as I said earlier, such experiments will save a lot of time, and then they will save the financial resources, they will save the manpower. And therefore, it is very nice to add to the information of a proteome based upon the protein sequence to structure and function annotation. Right. So why should you believe that the protein sequence to structure to function have a relationship? What makes you believe? Because Christian Anifinson's experiments have demonstrated that it is possible to unfold a protein and refold a protein, and the refolded protein, a correctly refolded protein, has gained its activity, right? And then his experiments also have shown that the information for a protein to fold lies in its amino acid sequence. So this is one reason to believe that our flowchart of protein sequence to structure to function relationship is a valid direction. And then again, Cyrus Leventhal's paradox said that no matter how big a protein is, it will always fold very quickly into a unique structure, and this unique structure is the low energy conformation. More importantly, because it is not going through, see, if it has to go through all the conformational searches, then it is possible that it is held in a low energy minimum conformation, a kinetically stable energy conformation. But then Leventhal's paradox says that it does not go through all conformation searches, but then only few points are going through these folding events, and these events allow a protein to fold correctly. Therefore, it is always a thermodynamically stable structure that we are arriving at. Therefore, whether you solve the structure today in Hyderabad or whether you solve the structure, say in Naipur Mohali a year from now, or somewhere else in USA 10 years earlier, the structure will always remain the same, provided the crystallization conditions and so on also remain the same. And proteins which share high sequence similarity greater than 40% will have similar structure, and then they are also bound to have similar function. And the proteins with, this basically means that the proteins that share low sequence similarity can also have similar structure. That is, therefore, we have far fewer structural folds, but then we have 100-fold higher protein structures, or more than that. And also, the evolution of similar enzymatic function on different folds. I'll show you an example of this. That is, what basically it means is that you have the same enzymatic function, that is the function of the of a set of proteins is same, but then their three-dimensional structures are different. This is also what has been observed in the last few years. And then you have something called as a moonlighting proteins. That is, you have one protein that performs its initial function or the essential function, but then the same protein is able to perform very many other functions. For example, cytochrome C, electron transporter, is also responsible for apoptosis, and then the examples are very many here. And the example here is a DNA methyltransferase. And again, importantly, here what I said is that you have fewer folds, but then you have far higher number of sequences available. Therefore, there are very elegant methods to be able to recognize a protein fold based upon its sequence. It's a very intricate method. Fugue is one method, ITSR is one method, FIRE2 is another method. So all these are very nice methods to be able to recognize a fold based upon the primary sequence only. And once you model the structure of a protein, you just don't leave it like that, because you should be able to compare the model that you have built with the template structure. And also, you can also see is such structure available in the protein data bank already? And if so, what is its function? Therefore, there are protein structure comparison methods such as DALI methods. Whatever jargons I am using, I mean, these are not jargons, whatever technical terms I'm using, I'm sure the slides will be available with you. Please go back and refer to them and read the original papers, submit some of your jobs to the website and find out what these methods actually do. So DALI is a method that does structure comparison by structure superposition. It gives you something called as a Z-score, and the higher the Z-score, the lower the RMSD, the better is the structure comparison. Right. And this is again a very important development in the last, I would say, 10 to 12 years. That is, we have so far been discussing about the forward direction. That is, given a protein sequence, it is possible to model the structure of a protein. And once you model the structure of a protein, we can tell what is the function of a protein. Basically, this is a part of a kinase protein, a short part of a kinase sequence. And this is what a kinase protein would look like. I showed you earlier the BCR-able kinase protein. In fact, it's just inverted here. And this shows that the small molecule is binding here. And the role of the kinase is to be able to phosphorylate a tyrosine. On the OH of a tyrosine, there is a phosphorylation. So this is the forward direction that most of us have been learning for a very long time. In the last 10 to 15 years, a little more than that, there are many groups all over the world. Importantly, David Baker's group in the Washington University, USA, they have done something in the reverse direction. That is, because these principles in the forward direction are established, to be able to learn from the forward direction, establish certain rules, and then go with it in the reverse direction and say that given the function of a protein, is it possible to conceive a structure in mind? And given the, once you conceive a structure in mind, is it possible to design a sequence for this particular structure such that this structure is having a low energy conformation and it should be functional. Okay. So this is the forward direction, the protein folding, the reverse direction, inverse protein folding. This is a very important problem, and I think this has become quite straightforward, and I don't think there's much excitement in this anymore, excepting for your own examples. But the reverse direction is exciting, and those of you who are future graduate students applying for positions, for PhD positions, I think inverse protein folding problem is a very meaningful problem. Right. So what these groups have been doing is that they have a function in mind, they have arrived at a probable structure, and then they have written down the sequence, gone ahead, done the gene cloning, protein purification, solved the structure, and then the numbers of sequence structures that have been solved for the inverse protein folding are called as de novo designed protein structures. The numbers are increasing rapidly in the deposition of protein structure data banks. Right. I'll very quickly tell you that there are many methods for solving the structures of, modeling the structures of proteins. And the most traditional one and most reliable one, I would still say, is a homology modeling or a comparative modeling of protein structures. And then there are other methods called as the threading methods or the fold recognition methods. There are many methods for de novo ab initio methods. Professor Jairam, he was already a speaker in this platform earlier. I'm sure he must have told you about all the wonderful work that he's doing at IIT Delhi, and his methods for protein structure modeling. And then there are certain hybrid methods which use fold recognition method as well as the comparative modeling methods. Together they become the hybrid methods, and these are also very good methods for modeling the structures of proteins. Right. So this is the basis for the homology modeling. That is, first step what you do is you ask, given a protein sequence, is there a structure in the data bank already known, or a lookalike of it, or a homologous structure to this? And that is, this step is known as identification of suitable template structures related to the target protein. This can be done by something called as a BLAST search. That is, you go to NCBI database, go to BLAST, and then here the database will be PDB. You pick up the BLAST search, you do the BLAST search, pick up the template protein, which is a lookalike of yours. And then you do something called as a T-Coffee alignment, or alignment programs, T-Coffee, Clustal, doesn't matter which one it is. But then you have to do the sequence alignment of the target sequence that you are studying versus the template that you have identified from the protein data bank. And then you go ahead and do the modeling of a protein. Again, there are many methods. That is, you identify which are the structurally conserved regions conserved between the target and template, and then you find out the variable regions, and these variable regions are the loop regions in the proteins. And you so using these, you can model the structures of the proteins. And once you model the structure of a protein, one has to refine the structure of a protein such that there are no bad contacts. And so this is the refinement. And then you evaluate whether you're and modeling is a theoretical exercise, but then don't take it as a blind, pressing of buttons. First of all, you should know why you're modeling the structure of a protein, and secondly, you should go and read what is it that is known about the protein, right? Has somebody done mutagenesis of the protein and shown that these residues mutation has led to the loss of its function, or has allowed it to aggregate, so on and so forth. So though you're doing theory alone here, reading the experimental paper is most important, because these results, or these the papers from others on that particular protein or a homologous protein will throw many good insights about the what is the likely function of the protein. Therefore, you know that you don't want to go wrong anywhere in the model, right? And therefore, you evaluate the results of your model by doing the model validation, one method. Or second thing is, as I said, go back and read the literature, see what people have to say about the protein, see if there is a concurrence between your model and what the others have said about the experiments from the protein. If there is concurrence, then you believe that your model is right. Otherwise, you go back and build your model. And again, for this, when you use this method, the homology modeling method, the alignment between the target and the template is most important. If the alignment is wrong, if the protein sequence alignment is wrong, believe me, the models also will be wrong. So as I said, this is an iterative process. You keep doing it till you are able to build a correct model. Right. So I just took one example and very quickly go through this. This is a protein sequence that I have taken for a NAD kinase. And then once you do the homology search, you get certain protein structures. And then you take these sequences and then you do the multiple sequence alignment. This is what a multiple sequence alignment would look like. And then based upon this multiple sequence alignment, one can go ahead and build the model of a protein. And again, here what I see is that there is one particular insertion region only in this protein. And then this protein has an insertion here with respect to these two. Therefore, there are certain regions that are present in one protein, absent in the other two. There are certain regions present in the first protein and absent in the other, right? Therefore, when you want to build I didn't give the template, the target sequence here, but then if you want to build the structure of a protein, it is often good to use multiple targets, multiple templates. That is template 1, template 2, template 3. This is called as a multiple template modeling. Multiple template models are much better than a single structure modeling. Right. So if you feel that you have, if you believe that there is 40% sequence similarity between the target and the template sequences, then it so happens that the models that you have built are reasonably good. And then if you superimpose the structures, the root mean square deviation between them will be less than 2 angstroms, which is a good number. And if you feel that the extent of similarity is lower, 30% or 20% also, then as I said, there are many good methods. Fugue is one very good, my most favorite method that can be used to find out sequence alignments in the twilight in the twilight region between 15% to 30%, and then once again one can use build models based upon the sequence alignment that Fugue returns. But there are so many automated methods these days available in the internet, then that you don't even have to understand the theory. You just have got to know which protein sequence to model and why you have to model, right? That is sufficient. You can get a very colorful picture, but that is not what is recommended, because see, we are all gearing up to become scientists, future scientists. So we should know why we are doing, how we are doing, when we should do. There are many questions we have to ask ourselves before we actually do it. Therefore, understand the theory behind a method, practice it a few times, find out where you can go wrong in models, and then only you can go forward. So once you build a model, there are many viewers. This deep view Swiss PDB viewer is one of my favorite methods, because this came much before when nothing was available, this became available. Okay, followed by RASMOL. Okay, so I still have this on my desktop, and I use it. And then if you take Schrodinger also, they give you a viewer. Even if you don't have a software, we can write to them and ask them for a viewer. We can download, the academicians can download. Likewise, I think BioRxiv, BioVia, quite a few of them will give their viewers. They may not give the software, but then to be able to load a small molecule, to be able to load a protein, such things, such front ends are given by these software vendors to the students free of cost. Right. So here I've just put a few software that I routinely use. Modeler is a very old method that is based upon the satisfaction of spatial restraints. As you see the reference here, it's a 1993. All other methods came much later. And FIRE2 is another method. ITASER, Rosetta, Rosetta, all this come from, the USA. And then Swiss model, that Swiss PDB viewer that I was just mentioning about, Orion, EasyPred3D, all these are the methods. So if you go to Google and say FIRE2, it will take you to the page of FIRE2. You have to understand what this paper says. And then all that you have got to do is copy paste your sequence, and then you get a model. But usually what happens is, don't just believe the model that comes out from a computer. Download it, load it. As I said, superimpose it with the known structures from the past. Do a DALI search, find out if such protein structures have been there in the past. And then only when you do a thorough reading about the protein, believe the model. Okay, don't believe the computer generated models just like that. Take them by face value if they are usually good, but then many times we see that if the alignment is wrong, because it's a computer that is doing, the computer also can make a mistake in alignment, right? So the models that are generated are usually wrong. So it has to be taken with a pinch of salt. Do a thorough literature search, then only take it. And then once you model the structure of a protein, you're not sure whether the structure is good enough or not for your further studies. Therefore, ProCheck, I'll just spend a minute on ProCheck. I don't have a picture of ProCheck here. Anyway, our Indian biophysicist, Professor G.N. Ramachandran, who initially worked in Madras University and subsequently worked at IISc Bangalore, he has come up with something called as Ramachandran plot. That is, every given protein structure can have only certain values of phi and psi. That is, a rotation about NC alpha and C alpha C is called as a phi or a psi rotation. Therefore, only certain phi and psi values are allowed, was what demonstrated by Ramachandran. So this has been coded in an online manner by Roman Laskowski at EBI. He was then at Birkbeck College in UK. And he has come up with a software, and unless, so whatever model you get, you push it and you submit it to ProCheck, and only if the ProCheck says that it's a good model, then only you should take it. No residues should follow in the disallowed regions of the Ramachandran plot. Please model a protein as an exercise today and see and run Ramachandran plot. And again, a dope score, ERAT, PROSA, Rampage, these are all various validation methods that you can, these are all online and free methods, right? So now I'll show you in the next 20 minutes or so, what is it that we have done in our laboratory by building the models of proteins, right? So yeah, so this is an example I have already shown you. This is the structure of a BCR-ABL kinase. And this is the small molecule known as imatinib, and this is in clinical use for more than 20 years now. So it is about 2 decades that this drug is being taken by those patients who have blood cancer or chronic myeloid leukemia. And this protein is less soluble because the proteins have to be, the drug has to be soluble, right? So because of the insolubility of the drug, a mesylate form is given. Usually if the drug becomes insoluble, what is done is a salt form of it is made. That is, it will have a mesylate is basically a methylated sulfate. You can take it like that, okay? So it will have a negative charge, and therefore the drug is converted into a salt form. Therefore it becomes more soluble, and therefore the soluble form of the protein is also good enough. Its IC50 values, that is 260 nanomole concentration of the drug, is sufficient to kill, say, about 50% of the cells that have this particular blood cancer cells. And right, so though this drug is available for over 2 decades now, the drug is not effective on certain populations. For example, this picture shows you that the location where the small molecule is binding and what are the interactions that this protein makes with the small molecule. For example, there is a methionine 200 here, there is a aspartic acid 281 here, there is a methionine 318 here, and then there is a threonine 315. This is a very important amino acid, and most often this threonine 315 gets mutated to isoleucine because of either the genetically the person gets accumulates many mutations, because in the case of cancer the DNA repair mechanism fails, or there is an enzyme, there is a protein called as P53. The P53 will fail to function. Therefore the number of mutations that patient will have are many. Therefore there are many sites at which this particular protein gets mutated. T315 is the most important mutation, and therefore for all the mutant proteins of BCR-ABL, the imatinib does not work, right? Therefore, there are second generation drugs such as nilotinib, another drug called as dasatinib, another drug called as ponatinib. So all these are the drugs that have been, ponatinib is the later stage of the second version of second line drugs of BCR-ABL kinase. So okay, there's a slight difference here. If you see the drug, if you do the structure superpositions of protein structure complexes, you see that the yellow color dasatinib is actually protruding outside. This is because what happens here is the dasatinib bounds to a active state. The kinase flips between the active state to an inactive state, a functional form to a non-functional form. Therefore, dasatinib is able to bind to another conformation of a protein, and therefore, in this case, it goes into a back pocket, and therefore you see that this is what the structure superposition looks like. Anyway, you see that all of them are binding to a similar pocket in the protein structure, and this slide shows that this is the BCR-ABL kinase, and then there is a P loop here. Or a phosphorylated loop here. There is an activation loop here. These are very important for the conformation changes in the protein, and these are all the sites where the mutations take place. For example, here at 255th position, the initial amino acid is E, glutamic acid. It can either change to a lysine K or a valine V. Okay, that is this is having a COOH group. From a acidic amino acid, it can go into a basic amino acid or a hydrophobic amino acid. So that is the kind of mutations that take place in the BCR-ABL kinase. So though there are so many inhibitors, all of them fail to inactivate the mutant proteins. Therefore, there is always a need for new drugs. Therefore, as I said, ponatinib was another drug that was discovered. and it is able to, and okay, the lower the IC50 value, the better it is. Okay, that's one way of looking at data. So here what we can say is that while imatinib is having higher values for many of the mutations, nilotinib works on several mutations. Dasatinib also works on many mutations, but the value is high when it comes to T315I. But ponatinib is a very wonder drug which is able to work on not only the native and other mutations, but it also works on the T315 also. So what we have done was, we have done the structure superposition of BCR-ABL kinase complexed with ponatinib, BCR-ABL kinase complexed with imatinib. And when the structure superposition has been done, what we see is that the structures are, proteins are highly superimposable. The drug molecules also are highly superimposable. So the question we have asked is that, in spite of high similarity in protein structures and also the orientation of the small molecules, how is it that ponatinib is functional on several mutations? It is active on several mutations, whereas imatinib is not functional. Okay. Therefore, with this question in mind, we have generated mutants, or we have modeled the mutants in the BCR-ABL kinase structure, and then we have done the MD simulations of mutant proteins and the native protein with ponatinib as a complex. So this particular slide shows that these are all the sites where we have done the modeling of the mutations in the protein structures. For example, some of these amino acids are in close contact with ponatinib, shown in red here. Some of them in green are not in direct contact with ponatinib, but then they are in the vicinity. Some of the amino acids are away from the active site. So here, having done the modeling of the mutant proteins, the second question we have asked is, okay, from the crystal structure, what we usually get is a static structure of a protein, right? But then we know that structures are never static. The structures are always there is always a wiggling and jiggling of bonds. Therefore, we have something called as an IR spectrum. Therefore, in order to understand the dynamical states that are present in the protein, we have done the MD simulations of the mutant proteins in complex with ponatinib, right? And after we have done the MD simulations, what we have done is something to calculate the binding free energies. So basically, what we do is we see the net amount of energy as a protein ligand complex. That's one value. And then what is the energy of the protein alone? What is the energy of the ligand alone? And these two you subtract from the complex. Okay. So if the complex is stable enough, then the free energy of binding of the complex should be lower. Rather, it should have a high negative value, or it should have a lower energy. So with this in mind, we have done the MD simulations of protein ligand complexes, and just to verify whether our answer is right or wrong. Okay, this is the range of IC50 values, and this is the range of free energies that we have obtained. And BCR-ABL is able to bind to dasatinib and it's able to inhibit it. Therefore, it is having a free energy, but not as high as the ponatinib binding to the mutant proteins, which basically means that ponatinib is a better inhibitor compared to dasatinib or imatinib. Okay, in the case of imatinib and BCR-ABL T315I also, the value is lower, indicating that a higher value of binding free energy is a better way of identifying a better drug at any given situation. So this is in fact a standard method for computational studies to see if you have many molecules. In order to be able to rank the molecules, it's always good to go ahead and calculate the binding free energies. I'll just skip this slide. So basically what happens is the mutation that you are studying is in the vicinity of several other amino acids. Therefore, we have gone ahead to study whether the mutation, the mutant protein, how does it affect its neighboring amino acids, we have seen that some of them are increasing the energy, some of them, when you say it's increasing energy, these are all positive amino acids. They're happy with the new mutation. And when it decreases the energy, it basically means that these particular amino acids are not happy because of the mutation. So such studies can be done. And I'll just take you through one more example of a protein which is a hypothetical protein in Helicobacter pylori genome. That is, only the ID was there and it was called as an initially predicted coding region, but nobody knew what the protein did. Therefore, based upon our structure modeling and functional annotation, we could show that this protein is able to function as a nitroalkane dioxygenase. And from the structure, we could show that this protein folds into two-domain protein, into a two-domain protein. The N-terminus has a TIM barrel, and the C-terminal region has a different folding pattern with several alpha helices and beta strands. And importantly, we could show the location of the cofactor FAD or FMN binding site, and we could show that where the FMN cofactor binding takes place. Okay, I usually keep these slides to show the students that this is a region that is very important for binding to the cofactor. But the FAD2 method that we had used actually gave us a wrong alignment at this location here. So if we had used the alignment straight away as given by the software, then we will end up having a wrong model, and therefore our inferences also will be wrong. Therefore, before or after the model is built, it's always good to go back and check the alignment and correct the alignment and do the modeling. Then only you believe that you get the correct model. Okay, so based upon the corrected model, we could build the correct 3D structure. This is the structure superposition of the model and the template, and we could show where the FMN binding site is there. This particular site is the position where FMN binds, and then such amino acids will have a sequence motif which is GAT, and this GAT sequence motif is a standard binding phosphate binding motif. We could locate that, and close to it will be a glycine, and close to it will be a catalytic base, one histidine. So we could map not only model the protein, but then we could show the active site, the functional site, and also where the cofactor binds. So these are all the way. So from this exercise, what I'm able to show you is that a protein for which was initially a predicted coding region, as shown here, we could model it and tell a lot more about the function of the protein. Right. I'll again quickly take you through. I've again chosen this example to show that whenever there is a disease state, there is something called as a epigenetic alteration. This happens more in the case of cancers. There is something called as a DNA methylation takes place whenever there is a disease onset. And this, as I said, usually happens in cancer. And this is again a Helicobacter pylori protein. And then the DNA methylation can take place on a cytosine at the C5 carbon here, or the methylation can take place at the N4 position here, or it can also take place at the N6 position here. So these are all the sites of methylations by DNA methyltransferases. That is, these are proteins. DNA methyltransferases are proteins that will methylate DNA at various locations: C5, N4 on cytosine, N6 on adenine, and then because these are methyltransferases, they require a methyl donor, and the methyl donor is basically a S-adenosyl methionine. So there is a methyl group on the sulfur here, on the L-methionine here. So this is a donor of a methyl group, and after the methyl group has been transferred to the DNA as a substrate, then that itself becomes S-adenosyl L-homocysteine. Therefore, this is the change that happens. So this is before the action or before the enzymatic activity, and this is what happens to the cofactor after the enzymatic activity. So, right. So we have seen that there are three different types of methyltransferases, three categories of methyltransferases, and which can be categorized as at the C5 position, and the methylation is on cytosine, on adenine, so on, and on cytosine at the N4 position, and therefore these are given different nomenclatures. And here, if you see the structure of the protein, we see that the structures of the proteins are quite similar, but then it is very difficult to superimpose them. Therefore, we say that these proteins are having different folds as indicated here. And this TRD basically means the target recognition domain, or the site where this protein can recognize DNA as a substrate. Therefore, we see that the target recognition domain is sometimes in the middle, sometimes it is at the C terminus, sometimes it is at the N terminus, and their folds are also present here. So this is an example of a protein where the function of the protein is same, is to transfer a methyl group to DNA. That is, the function is same, but the folds of the proteins are different, right? Okay, so we have modeled the structures of each of these proteins in DNA methyltransferases, and we have shown the region where the DNA will bind. We have also shown where the cofactor SAM or S-adenosylmethionine will bind. And from the structure modeling, docking of these small molecules and the DNA, small molecule is basically SAM here, and the DNA here we could show the fold of the protein, we could show the structural features of the enzyme in its action. We could catch the enzyme in its action because we have done the MD simulations of this protein also later on. And this is the last part of my presentation. Our lab extensively works also on Mycobacterium tuberculosis proteins, and yeah. So the genome of Mycobacterium tuberculosis was solved in 1998. So it's over 20 years now that the genome sequence has been deciphered, and it was solved by Cole et al. And it has 4,000 genes roughly. Helicobacter pylori is quite small genome. It only has about 1,500 genes, and this is a large genome, and 4,000 proteins are there. And to the surprise of the genome sequences, what they have seen is that this proteome has PE and PPE families of proteins. That is, it has an N-terminal PE domain followed by a C-terminal region, which can be either a unique sequence or it can have polymorphic glycine-rich regions, so on and so forth, of variable lengths. You see, this PGRS region can vary anywhere from 40 to 1,680 amino acids. So that is the variability in terms of the sequence length. Likewise, you also have many PPE proteins which also have variable C-terminal regions. So what our lab has done is, because these the PE proteins have 110 amino acids conserved domain with P, that is proline and glutamic acid, at 9 and 10 position, and proline glutamic acid sequence motif also is present at the N terminus, but nothing is known about the C-terminal region, which is of variable length. So we have taken these variable regions in the PE and PPE families of proteins, and then we have, so what we have done is we have taken these regions and we have tried to annotate their function based upon the structure. So we have taken the sequences of the variable C-terminal regions, tried to find out what is the likely structure that this region would take. And what we have seen is that in majority of the PE and PPE proteins, we have certain properly folded domains, and these domains are actually functional. For example, there is a certain region, glucosyl 3-phosphoglycerate phosphatase domain. Earlier I had told you that a kinase is the one that is whose role is to add a phosphate group to a recipient substrate. Likewise, a phosphatase's role is to remove a phosphate group. That is, it undoes what it reverses the action of a kinase. Okay, so phosphatase is a protein that removes a phosphate from a protein or any substrate. Okay, carbohydrate doesn't matter, DNA, not DNA, lipids and so on. So this is one such protein which does the reversal of, which is a phosphatase, and then there is a laminary pentose producing beta-1,3 gluconase domain. So such proteins have a function to digest carbohydrates into smaller units. And this is also an endogluconase which will cleave a large carbohydrate in the internal ester bonds, ether linkages, sorry. And then there is also a chitinase domain. So chitinase is basically a poly-N-acetyl glucosamine. This chitinase domain is also present in many of the PE and PPE domains. And not only that, it has these catalytic domains, but it also has certain regulatory domains. And in one of my initial slides, I said that the proteins are functional as enzymes, and then they also function as adapters. So while for any of these enzymes to recognize a carbohydrate, first the carbohydrate should land on a hydrophobic patch on the surface of this carbohydrate binding domain. So there is one aromatic amino acid, another aromatic amino acid, another aromatic amino acid. On the aromatic amino acid, the carbohydrate will initially land, and then it becomes available for any of these enzymes to perform their function. Therefore, this is a very important role that this carbohydrate binding domain does in these glycosidases. Likewise, there is another motif called as a beta helix motif. So basically, helix will spiral upwards or downwards, but then it propagates in one direction, right? So while it is propagating, the regions of propagation are actually forming several strands, and several such strands stuck together will form sheets. Therefore, because of the presence of beta strands in the direction of propagation, these structure motifs are called as beta helices. Such beta helices are also present in carbohydrate digestive enzymes. So we have seen these also. And in addition, we have also found certain domains that are important for lipid hydrolysis and certain adapter domains. And this is a protein that was solved by Bharati and Sugna, which functions as a peptide hydrolysis. Aspartic proteinases will cleave a peptide bond in proteins. So somebody else had solved the structure of this protein before we discovered this domain or annotated it. So what we have taken is, we have taken one particular protein in our laboratory, which is a alpha by beta serine hydrolase domain that is present along with certain PE or PPE proteins in Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This is the code for the protein RV1800. So we have taken these proteins, we have, okay. So what happens is, this is the full length protein with a PE domain followed by a region that functions as an alpha by beta serine hydrolase. So we have a question as to if this region is functional as a alpha by beta serine hydrolase, which is responsible for hydrolysis of lipids. What is the role of the N-terminal PE domain? How does it affect the function of this domain is the question we had. So we have cloned the proteins, the full length protein as well as the domain alone, and then we have cloned them with in PET vector such that it has an N-terminal histidine tag. We have soluble proteins, and then we have also mutated the active site serine to alanine, and then we have also done a Western blot and shown that both the full length protein, its domain alone, and the mutant protein are recognized by the antibodies. And then we have done certain experiments and shown that this particular protein does not have any cutinase activity or lipase activity, but then it is able to hydrolyze short chain length fatty acids. Importantly, basically the assay is something like this. You have a paranitrophenyl ester is the substrate of a C2 chain length, of a C2, C4 chain length, C6, C8, C10. Like that, the chain length will keep increasing. And then this paranitrophenyl ester, upon hydrolysis by the enzyme, will give rise to the fatty acid. In this case, ethanoic acid, and it will give rise. And the product is like ester hydrolysis will give you acid and alcohol, right? So the paranitrophenol is the product, and the paranitrophenol will have a very mild color, and its absorbance can be monitored at 410 nanometers, the yellow color of it. And therefore, by measuring the accumulation of the product formed, we were able to find out we were able to catch the enzyme hydrolysis, and we have shown that the enzyme is most active on C6 substrate. It also is active on C4 as well as C8 substrate. And we have also seen under what pH conditions and temperature the enzyme is most active. And as I said, we have mutated the protein, and we have seen that the mutant protein is inactive, and also in the presence of inhibitor PMSF, that is a 10 millimolar paramethyl sulfonyl fluoride, which is a esterase inhibitor. We could see that the enzyme is able to completely lose its activity. Therefore, based upon the sequence, we could tell what is the likely fold, and based upon the likely fold, we could tell what are the likely functions the protein would have, that is a lipase, a cutinase, or a esterase activity, and we could show that our protein is functioning as an esterase and it does not function as a lipase or a cutinase. And these slides show, the next two slides show that we have done further work on many of these proteins, in this PE and PPE families of proteins. So the take-home message here is that it is possible to model the structures of the proteins. It's good if you are able to solve the structure, but then one need not wait for the structures to be solved. But then one can model the structures of proteins and do very many, nice pieces of study. That is, one can find out where the sites of mutations are. In fact, you can also extensively collaborate with experimentalists or chemists and tell them that these are the likely molecules that this enzyme, that this molecule is binding. Therefore, if they can synthesize and somebody else can do the experimental validation of the small molecules, that is one way. That is, you can participate in the drug design studies, or if you have a biochemist as a friend, you can tell them what is a likely site that they can carry out a mutation and therefore tell whether their protein is having that particular activity or not. So a modeling does not end only in the computer. It will also give rise, it can also lead to many good papers, and you can do a lot of work with it. And with this, I thank the audience and the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and I can take any questions if you have. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your nice and elaborative lecture. And you have covered all the aspects of protein structure, function, as well as you have shown experimental evidence also in your lab. Yes. How you have performed all these calculations. So due to time constraint, I will take two quick questions, ma'am.
Sure.
And one student is asking, is it possible to measure IC50 value through computational?
No, IC50 is only an experimental data. One has to do experiment for it, but what you can do is, see, doing these experiments is very elaborate and it requires a lot of money also, right? So what you can do is, you can do the protein ligand docking. After you have done that, you can do MD simulations. There are many methods, and I just showed you the free energy calculations. One can also do this there are other methods like MMPBAC, MMGBAC. Many methods can be done, and therefore you can shortlist the molecules and say, instead of doing experiments on 10 molecules, you can only do experiments on 5 molecules to save money. So IC50 is experimental method only, but then you will have corresponding values. So if you expect to have low IC50 value, then you expect to have a high free energy value also, negative high value. That's what I meant. IC50 is experiment.
Thank you, ma'am. One last question, ma'am. Like in computational, that most of the things we are able to identify the inhibitors. So what about agonist? Whether is it possible? How much it is reliable if we identify agonist molecule against the target? Is it possible, or is it reliable?
Well, I wouldn't answer this question because there are many people, many research groups, okay, who have who could design good agonists. And then there are many who could actually, could not have a successful, nothing is coming out of the lab. Okay, especially in the case of GPCRs, I know many colleagues, who are having hard time in doing this. So if you want to work on agonist, I wouldn't, take this strategy necessarily.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your nice lecture. And on behalf of DDS 2020 team, as well as our director, Dr. GN Sastry, I would like to thank you for your nice lecture. And you able to finish on time.
Thank you so much.
We have one more announcement, like without further delay, that we will join for the vertical 2 session within
Sure.
5 or 10 minutes. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So I log out now.
Yes.
Thank you.
So,